Welcome everyone, Costin here with a ranking of every single Total War game that's come out since Rome 1. I am not going to touch on Shogun 1 or Medieval 1 because I do feel they're way too outdated. It's like ranking something like Warcraft 1 or Dune 2, games that were very significant when they originally came out, but haven't aged very well since then. So I'm going to cover every game since Rome 1 to Warhammer 3. And I'm going to start in chronological order with Rome 1. I think it's an A-tier game. I think it's one of the best games that's ever come out in the entire series, and I think in a lot of ways when you're thinking about campaign mechanics, when you're thinking about music, when you're thinking about atmosphere design, is one of the best Total War games even to this day. When I was playing the remastered version, I was surprised by how enjoyable dealing with the campaign mechanics could be even at this stage. So it's certainly a top tier game from my perspective. I do think that for all the things that Creative Assembly has changed since Rome 1 and Medieval 2, that Rome 1 certainly does stand the test of time. It can be a really fun game to play. There are some downsides, of course, and those downsides mainly relate to the battles. The campaign mechanics, yeah, they're pretty good. The battle mechanics, the pathfinding, the AI, the battle AI, hell, even the campaign AI, they're all pretty terrible. Let's be clear on that. The auto-resolve is absolutely atrocious, and I do certainly think that it does impact your enjoyment of the game. It was an issue even back then, when it came down to AI and pathfinding, dealing with sieges, dealing with any walled settlement or settlement in general was not an enjoyable experience. But even so, even despite all those issues and the issues in open field battles, Rome 1, in a lot of ways in the campaign mechanic department, does stand the test of time. It doesn't hold up quite as well when it comes to battle mechanics, and I think that one of the things they should have focused on with the remaster were those mechanics, the AI in battles, the pathfinding in battles, etc. And I also don't think the pacing of the battles is all that great. Units can be very quick to die, to be completely obliterated, and that's something I've never really enjoyed in a Total War game, where units just get completely obliterated potentially in seconds. That's not a fun experience. Some people prefer that, I understand, but I admit a slower paced, a more tactical game works better from my perspective when we're thinking about Total War. But yeah, Rome 1 battles can be some of the fastest in the series in a lot of ways. At least when it comes to kill speed of units. Sure, some battles can be very slow, but more often than not, like you get a volley of arrow fire to hit the enemy, or you get a mass of archers to hit the enemy. Yeah, they're gonna die very, very quickly unless there's some extremely heavy units, and even then, they're still gonna take significant damage. So I think the battle pacing, battle design, all that does leave something to be desired. But the campaign mechanics were extremely good. Anyway, to move on, Medieval 2. Medieval 2 is an S-tier game as I see it. Even to this day, and when they do release a remastered version of it, I think it's going to be enjoyed by quite a lot of people. Sure, it still has the AI issues, the pathfinding issues, etc., but those aspects are improved. The battle pacing is improved compared to Rome 1. And the campaign mechanics, while different in quite a few ways, also do stand the test of time in a very, very good way. It does create enjoyable campaigns. Sure, performance isn't necessarily the best in this day and age. Performance has never been that great in previous Total Wars. It's always been an issue. And the performance of Medieval 2 certainly can leave a lot to be desired, especially in some of the bigger battles that you can have in this game. But there's a reason why this game was probably the most modded of all the Total War games. It had a really solid core to work with. Good core in terms of battles, good core in terms of campaign mechanics that people could use for various mods. And a number of expansions came along, also helped things along. Lots of additions were made to this game. Had a good amount of content, had a pretty good scope. Maybe not the largest scope of any Total War game, but had a pretty good scope. Had very different factions. Had a lot on offer, I feel, when you're looking at Medieval 2. One of the things I do appreciate is the slower pace of battles. Granted, some things can go very quickly, but battles felt a lot more tactical than they did in Rome 1, and for that I give it significant points. Like, both Rome 1 and Medieval 2 have fantastic soundtracks, fantastic design, a fantastic feel to both of them, and in a lot of ways these were the definitive games for people that started playing them, and in quite a few ways they still are. There's been no game since Rome 1 and Medieval 2 that have really surpassed them. I mean, sure, there's games with better performance, better AI, etc., but like just the sheer impact these two games had on a lot of people, on a lot of players, is something that Total War games since then have not surpassed. Maybe come close to equaling it, though there's a point of disagreement if you want to have that. But yeah, no Total War game has really surpassed the impact of these two games, especially, I feel, when it comes down to Medieval 2. Then there is Empire Total War. I'm gonna give Empire a D tier. I think it deserves it. It was rough on launch, it's still a very rough game. It's really broken in a lot of ways. Melee combat is pretty terrible. Battles are pretty terrible. Yeah, sure, the range combat works decently, I suppose, though it's not great. And it's just incredible how stupid AI can be in this game compared to even previous games in the series. I mean, AI has always been an issue, but it's like Empire, they just couldn't handle it. Sure, the naval battles can be nice, can look nice, but I also feel that there was a lot lacking in this game. Maybe the scope was too big, considering that they were developing a new engine, introducing naval battles in the series, trying to do a lot of things at the same time, and that did degrade the quality of this title by quite a significant amount. You can do too much and it can blow up in your face, and that's certainly the case with Empire Total War from my perspective. Trying to do too much didn't work out, and some of the ideas they had weren't necessarily the best. It does cover much of the world as we know it, not all of it, but much of the world as we know it, but it's also lacking in polish, genuinely. It's lacking in polish compared to quite a lot of other Total War games. It probably had the worst release, or one of the worst releases of any Total War game that's ever come out, and that's still something that we feel to this day. And then we get to Napoleon. Where would I rank Napoleon? Well, this is a tough one, I admit, for me. From a logical perspective, Napoleon is just a bit better than Empire. But in reality, it's actually a lot better than Empire, because it's a lot more polished. The design of the campaigns is a lot better than what we got. Sure, it's a more narrow scope, and some people don't like that. They do like their huge open world sandbox, so to speak. But I think Napoleon Total War did significantly benefit from a narrower scope. The quality went up in pretty much every single way imaginable, and I personally did prefer the various smaller campaigns that Napoleon Total War did have beyond just the sandbox. But I did appreciate the various campaigns, the Italian campaign, the Egyptian campaign. I did appreciate those greatly, and having like a story-focused game, as much as you can have that in a Total War game anyway, as opposed to just the pure sandbox. So Napoleon is a really good game, especially compared to Empire, and it does offer an experience that you may not see in any other Total War series. It's not just that it's narrow in scope, it's that they take that narrow scope and make it work in a way that other games in this series that are more narrower in scope just don't work. So yeah, I would say Napoleon from a logical perspective is probably a C tier, though you could also consider it B tier, but I'm not going to rank it B tier. I'd say C plus if you want to go with that. Whereas Empire could be considered the D minus, really. Then we get to Shogun 2. Well, Shogun 2, a lot of people can have mixed feelings. Some people didn't like the scope of the game that just focused on Japan, and we don't have much of it. That a lot of the factions felt pretty much the same. Sure, there were differences, but there was a lot of similarities, though there was certainly a good amount of quality. I would say And to be clear, I don't really enjoy Shogun 2, but I do think that if you look at the sum of its parts and what it has to offer, Shogun 2, especially Fall of the Samurai, but Shogun 2 as a whole, is certainly an A-tier game. It's nowhere near the level of Rome 1, to be clear. Rome 1 has a bigger scope and does a lot of things quite well, and in quite a few cases better than Shogun 2. But Shogun 2 does certainly capture the various eras it's covering, be it the Rise of the Samurai, the Civil War between the samurai clans, right, Oda Nobunaga and all that. Though it could have focused more on that from my perspective as opposed to the sandbox we ultimately ended up getting. I think like Shogun 2 really could have used different starting points, right, for campaigns. Like you could start with, yeah, each clan has one province, but they could have also benefited from the various political situations, like, you know, Oda Nobunaga rising to power, dealing with what he has to deal with, then after Oda Nobunaga, and then Tokugawa Ieyasu's war for power in Japan. Also could have benefited from the Korean War, from the war between Japan and Korea that was fought during this time period as well. So it could have used some different campaigns, I feel, as opposed to just the one sandbox and then Rise of Samurai, Fall of the Samurai. But for what it is, it's pretty good. It actually has, from my perspective, the best siege battles in the entire series. I'm not joking on that. You don't feel the same frustration fighting the siege battles in Shogun 2 as you do in pretty much every other Total War game that you play. Because the castles themselves are fairly large. In fact, they're so large that there's no way any army could fit inside them. And that works surprisingly well. It creates far more interesting, compelling scenarios when you are fighting a lot of these siege battles, from the smallest castles to the biggest ones. The battles themselves, yeah, the open field battles may not necessarily be the best. The balance is completely out of whack in a lot of ways. Fire arrows, for instance. I remember when I first saw them in action, I considered that bullshit, especially coming from something like Medieval 2 or even Napoleon Total War. Just the sheer damage potential is imbalanced, is not the best design, but is compelling all the same. If you want to play a Total War game that's pretty good and modern and has stood the test of time in a lot of ways, I would recommend Shogun 2. Perhaps even more so than I'd recommend Rome 1 or Medieval 2, because yeah, they do have some rough spots. I think they're great games, but they do have some rough spots, where Shogun 2 is more modern and will actually run better than a lot of other games, and people may enjoy these Shogun 2, especially Fall of Samurai. I strongly recommend playing Fall of Samurai. Then we get to Rome 2. Oh man, what is there to say about Rome 2? What is there to say? It has to be mentioned that the quality of Creative Assembly titles ever since Empire came out was dropping. Like, people were displeased with what Creative Assembly were doing. Sure, Napoleon was a step up. I personally saw the writing on the wall long before Rome 2 came out. I was actually not pissed off about Rome 2 because it was pretty much everything I expected. I did expect that quality. In fact, I enjoyed Rome 2 when it originally came out. I know, it sounds shocking, but if you are a realist and you know what you're going to get in your hands, then you are not going to be surprised. So Rome 2, but all that said, Rome 2 is certainly a D-tier game. In fact, I would say it's probably one of the worst games in the entire series. The reason I say this is not just that Rome 2 had a bad launch, not just that Rome 2 had really buggy, broken battles, terrible AI, terrible design decisions throughout. Not only that, but even when they fixed it, they still didn't improve on all of those problems, because they didn't actually improve on that. In fact, it's the ways they made it worse. You want to know why in, say, if you're playing Warhammer 2, 3, 1, 2, or 3, you want to know why on Legendary you get the -8 public penalty there? Or you get the minus public penalty on any difficulty? Think Rome 2, and the fixes Creative Assembly improved. You want to know why the AI is playing in a very static way and always pretty much uses the same tactics and there's nothing surprising? Think Rome 2 and the fixes. I actually started to detest Rome 2 the more they fixed it, because it made them more annoying. Sure, the game was broken on launch, but you could get away with some fairly interesting things. Like, I played an entire campaign as Sparta when it originally came out on Legendary, And I achieved something that, some achievements. I want 2 achievements. One was to fight every battle, and I believe win every battle. Actually, yeah, one was to win every battle. The other one, if I'm not mistaken, was to fight every battle manually. And I did that, and it was actually quite a bit of fun originally doing it. I don't think that would work very well right now, ever since they fixed it and balanced it. Quotation marks apply here very well, I think. If there's a game that I would not recommend playing in any way, shape, or form, it's Rome 2, really. The DLC policy also wasn't that great, and this is where we really start Creative Assembly nosediving in a lot of ways as a company. Did they get back up from that? Sure. But it would take them some time to improve significantly as a company after the disastrous launch of Rome 2. And it's not just that. There were a lot of things promised in Rome 2, and there were a lot of things shown in Rome 2 that still aren't in the game. Remember that montage of Siege of Carthage and how that played out? Yeah, that's still not something you can do when you're playing the game right now. Huge disappointment, misleading marketing, horrible DLC practices that a lot of them do continue to this day. Let's be absolutely clear on that. Rome 2 was a game changer for the worse when we think about Creative Assembly. Then we get to Attila, and I know some people like Attila as they consider it probably the last quote-unquote good historical game, or pure historical game, I'd say. I wouldn't consider it a good game, really. I think Attila could have been very interesting, but yeah, I do consider it D tier. Nowhere near as bad as Rome 2. Let's be clear, some improvements. Major improvements, but the core issues that Rome 2 has carried over in Attila. Was Attila better? Yes. Was it still a broken pile of crap? Yes. And I understand people have made modding work for it, but what frustrates me about Rome 2 and Attila, the performance was genuinely miserable. And even to this day, you want to try running Rome 2 or Attila on a high-end computer, a modern high-end computer, let alone a high-end computer back then, you won't be able to do this. You won't be able to do it. And so they do get the worst marks on my list. I think genuinely they're best buried and forgotten. Yes, some modders still use Attila for obvious reasons, because the modding tools have been severely limited since that point, sadly enough. So if you want to create significant changes, right, to the game, not just in battles and units, but on the campaign map, I think Attila is probably your last good option for that. And so that's why I think it has a modding scene. I mean, there are some interesting things in Attila. I'd say they didn't make improvements in the siege battles, and certainly the settlement layouts in both Rome 2 and Attila were better than what we would end up getting. But those are just silver linings. There's nothing good about either Rome 2 or Attila that's anything more than a silver lining as far as I see it. The performance is bad. The way troops interact with one another is pretty bad. And none of those issues have been fixed. They've actually supported Rome 2 and Attila especially Rome 2, with quite a substantial amount of DLC, but I've never seen a reason to get back into either Rome 2 or Attila. I've played both of them quite a lot, and it's just like, yeah, forget about them. They're not worth playing. Don't spend your money on them. Don't waste your time on them. And if you do want to play one of these two, I'd recommend Attila, but it does have quite a lot of issues, I feel about it. Anyway, we start getting into the Warhammer games. What about Warhammer 1? Well, I think Warhammer 1 is probably going to be a C rating game. Look, let me just say it like this. The main goal of Warhammer 1 was recreating the Warhammer universe in a total war game, right? Recreating the units, the factions, etc. In that, they succeeded, but as a result of it, campaign mechanics did take a hit. Campaign mechanics, battle mechanics, siege battles, etc. did take a substantial hit. The maps of siege battles were simpler. We no longer had minor settlement battles, which we had enjoyed previously. And sure, they brought them back for Warhammer 3, but there were a lot of issues. Issues that carried over from Rome 2 and Attila. Issues that had carried over since then. I would say that they do deserve praise beyond just recreating the factions of Warhammer, and beyond having magic, flying units, etc., which should tell you something about the Total War fan base. Back then, when Warhammer 1 was being developed, a lot of people, just to give you an idea how stupid fanboys can be, were like, oh, it's too complicated for them to make single entities, monstrous units, basically, flying units, magic, all that, so we're not going to have that. Which would have prevented Warhammer 1 from being from being a Warhammer game, right? Without those things. But that's where the fan base was. They expected garbage, and Warhammer 1 wasn't garbage. Creative Assembly, they put a lot of effort. To be fair, I'm not gonna be giving Creative Assembly very high marks for this, though, because I think Games Workshop would never have allowed them to make a game like that that would have been a Total War game with a coat of Warhammer. No, Warhammer 1 is a proper Warhammer game, and for that, it needs magic and flying units and single entities, etc. So I certainly think that one of the big reasons the Warhammer Total War series has ended up being as good as it is right now is because Games Workshop is not gonna let them screw over their setting. And Creative Assembly has shown that when they are actually under pressure, when they do have someone looking over their shoulder, that they can do better things. And Warhammer 1 was an improvement, in some ways a vast improvement compared to the crap we had gotten for years, be it in Empire, Rome 2, or Attila. And even going back as far as Medieval 2, it's probably the best game. It ended up being, in a lot of ways, one of the better games that came out since Medieval 2. Yes, Shogun 2, with all the DLCs, with all the changes that they made, is a pretty solid title that can be enjoyed at the moment. But the overall quality of games since Medieval 2 came out was terrible. And that created a fan base that expected that. Thankfully, they did a lot better with Warhammer 1. They tried, and they succeeded. It would, however, take some time and an entire game until we see the full success of that. And then there is, of course, Warhammer 2. Where would I rate Warhammer 2? Well, I think you could say that the initial game had a lot of issues, but when you think of all the DLCs, the improvements, the way the factions played, which they copy-pasted in Warhammer 3, and with the exception of Cafe, none of the Warhammer 3's factions great, I would say that Warhammer 2 is certainly an A-tier game. It's one of the best in the series. It's not nowhere near as iconic as Rome 1, sure. But there were significant improvements made. Not in the Vortex campaign, but in Mortal Empires, you really saw a company, for the first time in their history, really putting effort through years and years of work through DLC packs and patches to take a game that may have started in a somewhat weak point, because Warhammer 2 did start in a somewhat weak point, to significantly improve it since then, fix it, improve it, polish it, and that has created a new standard that we do expect from Creative Assembly. So Warhammer 2 is a really good game at the moment. Especially if you're playing Mortal Empires, or if you want to play the Vortex campaign. I would not recommend the Vortex itself. It says something about the base campaign that, yeah, the Vortex is not recommended. But you can play certain legendary lords like Tarax, maybe Oxyatl, I guess, the Sisters of Twilight, Fraught, and enjoy their campaigns a great deal, even in the Vortex campaign if you want a more limited campaign. Or you can go for Mortal Empires and enjoy that if you so desire. Because in some ways, Mortal Empires and Warhammer 2, at least based on what people are saying, but even my opinion, I think there's certainly some issues in Immortal Empires at the moment that don't exist in Mortal Empires in Warhammer 2. So you see what comes out of a game where the developers don't abandon it and put a lot of time, effort, and energy. Then we get to Thrones of Britannia, which honestly doesn't even deserve a spot on the list, but yeah, it's the E tier. Actually, it would probably be F- and even below. So what is Thrones of Britannia? To understand that. Well, Thrones of Britannia is when Creative Assembly puts forth a far more limited budget to a smaller team to make a Total War game to compare to the big ones. Now, that was the intent of the Saga games, okay, and it hasn't necessarily failed in every respect. And there were certainly some interesting campaign mechanics, but all the performance issues, the campaign issues, the battle issues, a lot of those things did carry over in Thrones of Britannia. And the limited scope on the British Isles did not do this game any favors. So the campaign mechanics were limited. It was very easy and very quick. You could win a campaign until they imposed some limits on that, and that didn't do the game any favors. Players don't like being limited artificially. Like if we're failing to expand, it's because we're not doing a good enough job, not because the game is saying you will not expand until you achieve your culture or whatever. So I do think Thrones of Britannia ended up failing in a lot of ways as a game, because it had a lot of the same issues as Attila, but it didn't even have the scope of Attila. Because Attila is covering at least all of Europe and much of Asia, Middle East, North Africa, right? It covers quite a bit. So does Rome too. Thrones of Britannia just focusing on the British Isles basically, and on a very particular point in history. Yeah, it didn't work so very well, I think. And it was abandoned pretty much shortly after launch. It had the worst launch of any Total War game ever released. That should tell you something. Yes, even worse than Rome 2, even worse than Empire. It was dead and buried and gone within days. Maybe weeks if you want to be generous. But that should give you an idea of how poorly this game fared. And why? Bad quality, smaller team, too ambitious. There were some good ideas, I feel, in Thrones of Britannia, especially when it came to recruitment. I think those are some ideas that they might have carried forward in future games, like, oh, you can't just recruit a doom stack, so to speak, right? You have to make a varied army. And you don't recruit a unit at full strength. It takes them a while to get to full strength, to give an idea of mustering troops as it happened in reality. I think those were some good ideas, but yeah, it just didn't end up working. And the look and feel of the game was also lackluster. I don't understand what's with the art style of icons in a lot of games. Hell, one of the better things of either Attila or Warhammer 1 or 2 is the way they've handled the icons in a lot of ways, as opposed to how they've handled the icons on units in Thrones of Britannia or Rome 2 default icons. Though there's certainly mods to improve on that. Then moving on to Free Kingdoms. Where would I say Free Kingdoms lands? It's a C-tier game. Sorry. I can't give it more than that. I wish I could, because I love the period. I think it's a really great period of time. But I do think that Free Kingdoms end up failing. The battles just weren't that interesting. Free Kingdoms was really where they improved the campaign mechanics quite a bit. Okay, we can appreciate that. They had different starts with the DLC. Okay, that's something you can appreciate. But the battles themselves, the mechanics of battles, the way they played, was lackluster. This is what happens when you take the Total War formula of battles and try and implement it in a historical game. I also think it suffered because they were trying to do two things at the same time. They had the romance mode and the records mode, and trying to balance two very different modes in a campaign in a game series that's never really had the best balance to begin with and has always struggled when it comes to that, ended up hurting the game in quite a significant fashion. And although it was more popular than Warhammer 2 and one of the most popular Total War games for a while, it did drop off. The developers didn't abandon it. Players abandoned it. Could Creative Assembly have chosen a different path? Perhaps. But at some point, they had to decide when enough was enough. And they did with Free Kingdoms. We'll see what they end up doing in the future, but if they just keep going down this path with historical games where they try and copy the battle mechanics of Warhammer with single entities and the like, it's not going to end up working very well for them. Historical games, if they do that, they're just going to end up being feeling lackluster compared to the Warhammer games. And Warhammer games already have enough battle issues. Let's be clear on that. But yeah, that's something that's something that was disappointing in Free Kingdoms. However, something has to be said about the campaign improvements as opposed to Warhammer games or as opposed to previous Total War games. Lots more options, lots more interesting things to deal with. Hell, Rome 2 wishes it had the campaign mechanics of Three Kingdoms. Maybe that would have helped save it from its disastrous launch. But it didn't. And it still doesn't. Anyway, we move on to Troy. Available for free, covering the Trojan War. Where would I rate Troy? Well, it's an interesting one because I think Troy in some ways has some of the best campaign mechanics of any Total War game to date, in terms of its economy in particular, though diplomacy is also something that works. As opposed to, say, Warhammer 2, where you just end up in the Doomstack, where you end up with fighting Doomstack after Doomstack after Doomstack constantly on the campaign map, and AI gets ridiculous bonuses. Things feel a lot more fair, but still challenging in Troy. So in terms of campaign difficulty, campaign mechanics, campaign design, Troy is great. However, despite all of those improvements, I think Troy can't be offered more than a C tier, and I think I'm being generous with that, to be honest. Because the battles, again, suffer from the same issue that Three Kingdoms does. It also is more limited scope, so it does have some issues when it comes. And I think the limited scope really ended up hurting Troy. Especially when they limited the scope to basically Greece and Anatolia. But at the same time, they made a focus on sea battles, so to speak, in a game that didn't have sea battles. Didn't have navies, proper navies. So what the hell is up with that? Also, I think they made a mistake, significant mistake, by not having the mythological units from the start. And even the way they implemented the O's and Mythos just didn't end up working very well. And like with Three Kingdoms, different modes, trying to design and balance different modes well, just doesn't work exceptionally well. Because, again, Creative Assembly has always struggled at. It probably was a nightmare for the smaller development team that they had working on a Total War Saga Troy. And it was felt. A Total War Saga Troy, for all the great campaign mechanics, I love the economy, for instance. I love the trading system. I think that it offers much different and better possibilities than we've had in any other Total War game. So to some degree, like if I was just talking purely on a campaign mechanics level, I could rate this B or even A, or A minus at least. Though there are certainly some things lacking, because initially, and this is still the case, they were like, okay, we have a smaller budget, what do we do to make each lord interesting? Oh, it's like, okay, only one has global recruitment, only one can have vassals, and all that kind of stuff. I do think that stripping away features, regardless of what they added, because they added a lot in terms of diplomatic options, trade options, economic options, they certainly made the campaign mechanics far more interesting. It's the campaign map that ended up hurting the game. I think a Trojan War game should have just been about Troy and its surroundings, and they could have had a big map around there and not have Greece at all, because yeah, the Trojan War wasn't really about the armies of Troy invading Greece. That wasn't even a factor at any point, and yet we end up having that. So I think they could have actually focused on a smaller area, made more settlements there, and have a more dynamic campaign than what we ended up with. And what we ended up with is kind of mess. Again, I want to say Troy is a much better game than it actually is, but the battles are not good. The sieges, the settlement battles are not good. You don't feel like you're taking the fight to Troy. You don't feel the monumental task of taking the historic city of Troy, which took them 10 years. Sure, they didn't launch a 10-year siege where they were constantly encamping around Troy, but it was an incredibly difficult task, and it doesn't really matter here in a Total War Saga Troy. And yes, they suffered because they couldn't decide whether or not they want to focus on history or mythology. I think in the context of a Troy game, they should have focused on the mythology aspect and should have mythological units. And I do feel that they would have benefited far more if they had pulled an Age of Mythology style game in Total War. Instead, they didn't. And as a result of that, the game suffered. Because guess what? Bronze Age warfare is not necessarily that interesting in its own right. Sorry to say that. It's not necessarily that interesting. I think they realized that, but Mythos was still a little too late. And the implementation there was not that great either. Finally, we get to Total War Warhammer 3. Where would I rate that? Well, at the moment, with all the issues, yeah, it's a B tier game. It's good. Don't get me wrong on this. It's good. It's got a lot of things going for it, and there's a bright future if the developers continue supporting it. But there are some trouble spots as well. There's issues with AI. There's issues with minor settlement battles. There's issues with campaign mechanics. There's issues with the previous races. The Realms of Chaos campaign ended up feeling miserable. A lot of people abandoned the game. Like, you want to judge the success of a game? Judge it from this perspective. Warhammer 2 did not have such a massive player drop-off as Warhammer 3 did. And even with Immortal Empires, it has currently a major player drop-off. Now, people say, oh, it's Wrath of the Lich King, other titles coming out and all that. Sure, those have an impact. But it's lost almost 50% of its player base, its active player base, over the last couple of weeks since it came out, since Immortal Empires came out. There's a lot of people interested in playing Total War games. I think that's clearly been shown. This Warhammer 3, when Immortal Empires came out, was one of the top 10 games played on Steam for a while. So the interest is there. But there's also tons of issues, bug fixes, improvements that need to be made. I think, and while I do prefer playing it at the moment versus Warhammer 2, there are trouble spots that need to be fixed. Like, I would rate Warhammer 2 higher as a game right now, because, yeah, it's not as great in some ways. It's not as diverse in terms of its factions, though, honestly, the demonic factions are terrible. Kislev has a lot of issues, and there's some implementation of things that isn't that great in Warhammer 3. So there is work that needs to be done. But if they continue to work, if they put in the same kind of effort in Warhammer 3 as they did in Warhammer 2, it certainly could earn an A tier spot, I feel. If they do that. Remember, they were releasing DLC for years that brought vast improvements to the game in Warhammer 2. If they do the same thing in Warhammer 3, like revamping the dwarves, revamping Kislev, adding the Chaos Dwarves, etc., I think Warhammer 3 certainly could end up being one of the best Total War games that's ever been made. But we have to wait and see how that is. I know it's probably unfair to judge a game that's still in development in a lot of ways, right? That's still being worked on. But Creative Assembly dug their own grave on that. They did a piss poor job with the Realms of Chaos, and then they had to rush the release of Immortal Empires because, yeah, people were quitting their game. That's why Immortal Empires has come out not as full release, but as a beta. Because if they hadn't rushed it, the game would be dead and buried. And because Realms of Chaos was just killing the player base. That's where things stand right now. We'll see what ends up happening. I am somewhat optimistic, honestly, with regards to Warhammer 3. Actually, I am very optimistic with regards to Warhammer 3. There's a lot of fun to be had right now in the game. Don't get me wrong on that. I am somewhat concerned, however, about historical games. I'm concerned because Warhammer 1 changed the way the battles are played, right? And there were vast improvements brought in Warhammer 1, 2, and 3, or vast changes to the formula that they had used before. The problem I see is if they just copy that formula from the Warhammer games and try and put it into a historical game again, which they did with Three Kingdoms and Troy, if they do that again, they're just going to kill their own series. I'm not joking on this. I'm quite serious on this. If they try and do that shit again, it's not going to work. Now, could they just make another fantasy game in the future? Potentially, sure. They could. And they could abandon trying to make historical games if they're not even going to try making a good historical game. It's not that you can't make a good historical Total War game. Like, there's good games out there that are similar to Total War. Like, one of my favorites is Ultimate General Civil War, and I would strongly recommend it if you're interested in a game that has Total War style battles. Not the campaign, though they're working on the Revolution, which is going to have, in a lot of ways, Total War style campaign. We'll see how that ends up going. But yeah, I do think that Creative Assembly should be careful where they go from now, because I'm concerned that they saw the huge success of Warhammer. It's like, oh, we must copy Warhammer in future titles. That would not be a great idea. Anyway, that's all I had to say. Costin signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and I'll see you next time.